In this video, we're going to continue to add detail to our Subaru hood using Fusion 360 forms. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and today we're going to carry on with our Fusion 360 forms tutorials. We're going to be adding more detail to the hood of our car. But having said that, when we started this process, we begin to add a lot of minute details. Things like the two edges that are extremely close together in order for us to get really high resolution. While this is great and certainly the best option for making curvature continuous details, for our tutorial series, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds and really work ourselves into a corner. So we're going to take a step back and we're going to do this a simpler way by using, in this case, a creased edge. And later on down the road, we can come back and we can actually use tools like bridge, or we can add different bevels and we can crease these in other ways. But for right now, it's just going to be too difficult for us to add more detail. So if you have been following along and you have your own model, carry on with that. However, if you are just getting started and you want to continue where we are, you can use the download link in the description of the video and you can start from this point. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to go use Alt-1 on the keyboard to go back to my box display. And of course, you can also go to the utilities and display mode. Throughout this video and future videos, I'm going to continue to use Control or Command and the number 4 to hide the visible edges, and Control or Command and the number 6 to bring them back. And then I'm going to be using Alt-1 and Alt-3 to go back and forth between Smooth Display and Box Display. Once I'm here, it's important to note that as we zoom in, we've got these double edges that are really close together. So I'm going to double click on one, which will grab the entire selection, and then I'm going to hit Delete. If we go back to our smooth display using Alt and 3, we still have a crease there, but it's not quite the same. So I'm going to double click on this edge, go to Modify, and add a crease. Adding that crease is going to help me maintain that geometry that I'm looking for. However, it's not going to come at the cost of control of this body. It's not perfect, it's not the best option, but it is going to help us in terms of control. Another thing that I want to do is I want to fix this triangular patch here that we had. So I'm going to select this edge and simply hit Delete on my keyboard. This obviously causes some problems, but we're going to go to Modify, Insert Point. I'm going to select that vertex and I'm going to come all the way to the midpoint back here and say OK. Filling that back in will allow me to have that smooth transition. So once again, not the perfect option to exactly replicate the geometry that we're looking at, but this is going to help us simplify the process of modifying this geometry. So now that we've done that, let's go back to box display and let's take a look at these lines. You see how they're sort of branching out? So before I go any further, I want to make sure that I come in and I fix this by using Modify and Edit Form. I want to make sure that they are a consistent width from the other lines, so that way I know that I'm doing a good job of controlling the curvature. That's not universally true. There are times where they're going to converge or diverge, or we're going to have sections where we really need them to be closer or farther. This section up here is kind of showing that. However, this is not a final solution by any means. This is really just showing us where we're currently at. Another thing I want to do is box select from upper left to bottom right, this line. I'm going to pull this forward. And the reason I'm going to pull this forward is because I want to add a little bit of curvature to the front of the hood. I might not need to pull it that far, but I do want to add a little bit of curvature there. Let's say OK, and let's take a look at what we have. So once again, things are smoothed out. And another note that I do want to make is I'm using perspective with Ortho Faces, which means that as we rotate this around, we're viewing the model with perspective, but as soon as we go to a front view, it's actually going to snap to orthographic. Orthographic helps because it allows us to zoom really close into these details and make our selections. If we were on perspective and we zoom in, we're eventually going to go through the model and it becomes more difficult for us to get into those fine details. So sometimes I'll go back and I'll just use a pure orthographic, or I'll use pure perspective. But for right now, I'm sticking with perspective with Ortho Faces. So let's bring our canvases out and let's show the front. We've got this style line about where it needs to be, but it needs to begin to transition off to the left. So we need to take that creased edge, and instead of bringing it straight down, we need to start to transitioning it this way. And getting these arcs or these curves is something that's extremely difficult in the software and something that we're going to have to take a bit of time to learn. In general, when we do this process, we want to avoid using triangular patches or anything that's more than a four-sided patch, but there are certain cases where we just have to have a four-sided patch. This is going to be one of them. So I'm going to start by going back to Box Display, and then I'm going to go to Modify and Insert Point. I'm going to start at the center and just come all the way over to the right and say OK, and let it just simply bisect that. So now we have this transition. You'll notice that we have this sort of interesting look here, and that's just because we've come out through the blueprint image. If we want to fix that, we certainly can by moving the front plane, but it's not really of a concern to me because I understand that this is just a visual thing right now. That's not what our surface looks like. But over here, now we have this edge that's creased, and we really want to transition it to go to the right. So if we're transitioning this to go to the right, that means that we need to create a triangle. So I'm going to do this by using Modify and Insert Point again, and I'm going to try to come from up here to down here. I'm going to say OK, and then I'm going to go into my Modify, Uncrease, and I want to remove the crease from this edge and this edge here. And then I want to go to Modify and Crease, and I want to crease this edge as well as these three. We'll say OK, and then let's go back to a smooth display. When we look at smooth display, you can see that now we are transitioning that curve, and it's going off and to the right. There are some things that we need to do. For example, these edges need to move, and I'm going to do that from my right-hand side. I'm simply going to pull them back and down a little bit. We'll probably have to add a bit more detail here. We're just trying to essentially fake it for right now. But you can see that we are transitioning here, but this does not look very good. This is problematic for us. Let's say OK, and let's take a look at our utility Repair Body. When we repair body, there are some star points here, and these star points are generally things that can be fixed, but when they're not red, when we're not seeing something that's listed as red, then the red ones are going to be actual errors. So these labels, these star points, are showing us areas where we potentially have a lot of geometry that's coming together. If we go back to our box display, this is where we have this triangle section. And this triangle section is creating a star point because we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 edges coming in to the section, and then we have a 5th. So these 5 intersections, these 5 edges that are intersecting at that one vertex is creating that star point. And we have the same thing up here. We've got the typical 4 that we would expect to see, and then we've got a 5th one here. So how do we transition and how do we control this? Well, in order to do this, I'm going to add another division here. So I'm going to go back to my front view. I'm going to go back to Modify and try Insert Point. I'm going to come from this edge, and I'm going to come all the way to the center again. And again, we want to be extremely careful. We don't want to create more geometry than is needed. But at this point, it's going to be helpful for us to at least play around with it. We don't know if this is going to be the best option, but in some cases, it can be extremely helpful for us to have another section here where we can have our transition. So now that we see this coming down, we have a 4-sided patch here, we have a 3-sided patch here, and then we have another 3-sided patch here. What I want to do is I want to transition from this point over to here and just see how that looks, and I'm going to delete some other stuff in the process. So we'll go from here to here, and then we'll take a look at what we've created. So I want to go from there to there, but I no longer want this edge. I no longer want this edge. So now I've got a 4-sided patch here. I've got a 3-sided patch here. And we need to make sure that we take care of the creases. So we're going to go to Uncrease, make sure that we uncrease any of these edges that are past where we now want to go. And then we'll go to Modify, Crease, and we'll make sure that this edge is creased. So without doing anything else, let's go ahead and take a look at Smooth Display and see if that looks any better. As we look at it from the front, we can see that the transition looks okay. If we get rid of our lines by using Control or Command 4 on the keyboard, that'll get rid of those visible edges. You can see that the transition looks okay, but everything that happens over here in the middle, that does not look very good. So the box display looks okay, but the transition to the smooth display is where we begin to have problems. So this tells me that I need to do a little bit more work. I might not even need these edges, so I'm going to select and delete those edges. So once I get rid of those edges, let's take a look at the smooth display again. So this is looking better. It's not perfect, but it is looking better. So this transition is still okay, and everything that's happening on the inside of it is okay. I could potentially move some of this geometry, for example, these edges. These can move back and down a little bit to get more of that lip that I'm looking for. And then when I look at this from the front, we can see that this small triangle and this transition here, this is really where we're starting to have some problems. So let's go back to box display. Let's go back to our utility repair body. And now you see that we've got 3 star points in this area. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then this 5th edge coming in. Over here, we've got 5 and 5. And when we have these star points, these are going to mean that we've got a much harder time controlling the geometry. So we need to do some work in this area. We're going to go to Modify. I'm going to do this from my right side. And I want to bring this edge up. So what I'm looking to do here is I'm looking to carry that transition all the way down, and I want to keep it consistent. And even down here, I want to keep it consistent. So these vertices, I'm going to view from the top. And I want to make that width consistent in the hopes that it'll help me transition that geometry a little bit better. This one here, I'm going to bring out a bit. And then let's rotate around to the front and let's go back into smooth display mode. So that's already looking better. That transition is looking a bit better just with a few moves. Let's go back to our box display mode and maybe we can even delete some more geometry. Maybe we can get rid of some stuff. So from the front, you can see that there's a vertex there that we can't see. I'm going to use the transform and just pull that over. Again, just in the hopes that we can get that transition a bit smoother. And then now we really need to focus on this area here. It's not liking this transition, so I'm going to start by getting rid of this edge. I'm going to delete it. I'm going to delete this edge here. So now I've got 1, 2, 3, a 4-sided patch. So hopefully that 4-sided patch gives us a smoother transition. We can see it here. That is giving us that smooth transition. We do have that crease here. So we are working with the creased edge, and now it's looking better. I'm liking this transition. It's not perfect, but it is much better. This is one of those cases where we want to be careful that we don't add too much complexity to the model too soon. And sometimes you have to go back and you have to just delete. I'm going to make a couple adjustments here to the front. I'm going to go to box display mode, maybe pull this point out a little bit. Go back to smooth display. You can see what's happening is we're actually rolling under here. I don't like the way that that looks. And that's likely going to have to be fixed later on. It's not something that's easily fixed now, but we can manipulate it or modify it by moving this edge forward. So we're going to go to the top view and we're going to pull this edge forward a little bit. And then the same thing here. We want to bring these edges forward. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to work with this transition. We want to keep it consistent. So when I say consistent, what I'm really looking for is the distance. When I'm looking at this from the top, the distance between these 2 vertices and these 2 vertices here stays consistent. And that consistency is really what's going to help us make sure that this transition is smooth. Let's take a look at this in smooth display, see if we've helped it out a little bit. Looks a little bit better. And again, more geometry is going to happen down here for the rest of the bumper. So that means that we shouldn't waste a ton of time because as soon as we extrude this bottom edge and add more detail, it's going to begin to change the geometry anyways. So now that we have that portion taken care of, there is a lot more to do. Let's do a quick save to make sure that we capture everything that we've done. And we're going to move on to trying to create the wheel well and the transition out to the wheel well. So the first thing that I'm going to do is bring back my side blueprint. I'm going to view this from the side, in this case the right. And then I want to create a cylinder. The cylinder primitive, I'm going to select the YZ or the right plane, and I'm just going to draw a circle that matches the inside diameter of that wheel well. We're going to say OK. And you'll notice that I didn't change any of the settings. I probably should have, and there's no way to get back to that menu. So for example, if we wanted more divisions here, the best thing for me to do is to box select everything. You'll notice that this left off some of the faces over here, and that's because when you use the upper left to bottom right box, it's only going to select what it completely encompasses. If you go bottom right to upper left, it'll grab everything. So I'm going to start by subdividing this. When I subdivide this, notice how it changes the shape. It's no longer a cylinder. So that causes problems for me. I can specify the number of length and width faces, but it's not giving us that exact match. So let's change this to exact to make sure that we keep it more cylindrical. Now that I have that, I'm going to box select the bottom half and simply hit delete. When I view this from the right, I now only have sort of the upper portion. And I actually want to get rid of this section as well, because right now I'm worried about connecting the bumper to here. So I want to bring those pieces, I'm going to bring them up to that bumper line that I'm really working on. And the back, I'm not too worried. I'm just going to leave them where they are. But we do need to work on matching the shape a little bit better. Once again, upper left to bottom right is going to select only what is completely encompassed. So we're going to use modify edit form, and I'm going to begin just pulling some of these edges. I'm just going to pull them up to get a little bit closer to that shape. And once I'm there, I'm pretty happy. I'm going to rotate this around, and I want to box select all of this. And then I'm going to view this from the front, and I need to bring back my front blueprint. And I just want to pull this out to get it close to where the wheel should be. Once I've got it to that position, again, I'm going to begin making some selections. Again, bottom right to upper left is going to grab everything. Upper left to bottom right is only going to grab what's completely encompassed. I'm going to rotate this edge and then pull it in. I also want to do the same thing to this. I can do it by just grabbing a vertex. And what I'm trying to do is trying to get that transition. So the wheel arches on the car, on any car, are not going to be straight up and down. They're going to taper in. So you can see that we see part of the tire here, and then the bumper is sort of in this area. So we'll just want to make sure that we match that before we go any further. The next thing that we need to do with this, because we are working with symmetry, is we need to use symmetry mirror duplicate. This body across the midplane and say OK. That way, when we begin to actually combine the two together, it's going to create a single unified body. Let's go ahead and hide our blueprints. Let's take a look at this from the front. You can see we have both wheel arches, and now we can begin carrying the geometry out to them. There are a couple of different schools of thought on where you should start and what should be the beginning. If we look at this from the front, we could very easily carry the fender and bring it down, or we could carry the bumper and bring it over. Either are going to be just fine. But the first thing that I like to do with these wheel arches is I like to create the flat lip. Almost all cars are going to have a small flat lip, with the exception of some very high-end exotic cars. Most of them are going to have at least a very small lip, and it's really just to aid in manufacture and how they can roll the lip underneath and weld multiple pieces together. So it's mainly a feature of convenience in a lot of cases. So we're going to select that edge, modify. We're going to hold down Alt, and then we're going to use this corner option here in the widget, and that's going to allow us to scale. When we scale out, we're basically taking that selected edge and we're going out in every direction. I want to switch back to box display for this because I'm going to bring each of these vertices in, and I'm going to make them line up almost perpendicular to this inside edge, the edge we selected. Now, it's not similar, or it's not like doing an offset in a sketch. When you do this transform, or when you're actually creating or extruding these edges out by scaling them, it's going to move equal in both, in this case, Y and Z. That's the direction that we were scaling. So that can work in some cases, but for our fender, that doesn't really work. It's going out evenly in all directions, and it's not really based on the original surface. So now that we've pushed those out, I need to say, okay, I need to double click on this inside edge, and I'm going to add a crease to it. And the reason I'm going to add a crease is because there's always going to be a sharp lip there, and I don't want to add a bunch of small moved edges inside of here and try to control that with, with those close edges like we did on the hood. The crease is going to be a much better option for us, at least at this point. We can always go back and change the details, but this is going to give us a good start. And now that we're here, this is where we need to make the decision on, are we carrying the bumper over to the side, or are we starting from the top down? And again, either option is perfectly fine. In this case, I'm actually going to begin by just carrying the fender down so we can see that process. And I'm only going to do it for these 3 edges. I'm not going to worry about the edge down here where the headlight is, because we're actually going to cut a lot away. So now that I have those selected, modify, hold down the Alt key, and then we're going to begin pulling it out. I'm going to pull out a small amount. I'm going to let go of the Alt and do it again. I'm going to pull this down. I'm going to do it one more time. And then I'm going to go to a side view, bring back my side here, and then I'm going to begin manipulating these. So this one here is actually pretty close, and that's fine. But I'm going to move this edge up rather than grabbing the vertices. And that's because I want it to compress what's above it. I'm going to do this here. And the same thing up front. I'm not really going to worry too much about these, but I'm going to pull them back to roughly where the headlight is. So that way I just have a good reference. And it's always a good idea to check the underlying box display. You want to make sure that you're not introducing more problems than you have to fix later. So just make sure that you bring that back. And then you can see here, like this vertex, we can go ahead and move those. And I'm going to leave this 4-sided patch. It's really more of a triangle for right now, and we can always come back and fix that later. So now that we're closer, I'm going to bring this up. I know I'm going to need to transition between this fender flare, but this gives me a good starting point. I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to take a look at this in a smooth display, and note that we have a really gradual transition. Let's hide our blueprints for a second. But we have a really gradual transition, and that's not what we want. So if we go back to our box display, the way that we would fix that is by having another edge in here. And again, we want to be careful not to add too much detail too early on that we have to control. So in order to make that happen, I need to move these edges a little bit closer to this one, and I'm going to select them, use modify, and I'm just going to begin pulling them up a little bit. And I have to be careful with this one here where the headlight is. So I have to be careful that I'm not creating, again, more problems that I have to solve later. It's looking a bit better, but I'm going to take these 2 edges and I'm going to pull them out a little bit, get them a little closer. I'm going to do the same thing with this one here, just pull it out. And again, going back and forth to the smooth display. You have to note that when we do this, that the underlying patches that get created in the smooth display are not going to be in the same location as the box display. And that's okay. They don't have to be. And because we haven't finished off this area yet, I'm not too worried about what that face looks like or this transition here. I'm really just focused on what's happening at this fender. Is it curving tight enough, or do we need to make some adjustments? And from looking at it, I want to make a few more adjustments. I'm going to bring this in just a little bit tighter. Go back to my smooth display, and you can see that we're tightening up that transition. Again, we can always come back later and add more detail, but that gets us pretty close. At this point, I think it's good for us to stop and sort of kind of review what we've done to this point. We've created a lot of detail. We've added a lot of detail, and we still have a lot of detail to go. So if we take a look at this without the visible edges, you can see that we've got that crease that we've added. It's transitioning here. We know that we're going to have to do a little bit of work here to sort of fix this, but we also know that we're going to be adding more geometry. So that's something that we're going to address a little bit later. And we also know that we are transitioning into the fender and this extra body that we created here. So we know that we're going to have to do some work here. We're going to have to create some more of those edges. And that's all fine. We're going to work with everything that we have here to make sure that we understand how to use these tools. But if you think about the tools that we've used so far, we've really only started with creating a face, and we've also used a cylinder at this point for the wheel arch. In terms of the modification tools, we've really focused on using edit form. There's one that I haven't shown, which is called edit by curve, which gives you more of a spline handle control. But again, that's a little bit more advanced. We're not going to really go down that path right now. So we've used edit form. We've talked about subdivide on the wheel arches, but really we've used insert edge and insert point, and we've welded vertices together. We haven't really used merge edge. We used some of these other tools we've looked at, like slide edge and crease and uncrease, but we really haven't spent a lot of time with that, with the exception of just a handful of tools. We really haven't spent a lot of time using those other tools. So it's important to note that the geometry that we're creating really is not a product of the number of tools that we're using. It's how we're applying them. But as I said at this point, let's make sure that we save. We've done a lot of work. We want to make sure that we save this file. And we're going to continue on in these videos, adding more detail. I'm not sure how far I'm going to go with the car itself, but we will at least finish off this upper portion of the hood into the fender to make sure that we understand that process. And that's going to be a big jump forward in how you can apply these tools. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.